As I've pointed out before, there are parallels between the 1920s and the 1960s. These were both decades in the 20th century in which there was a lot of ferment, a lot of change, and a lot of optimism. In both the 20s and the 60s, which actually kind of progressed into the early 70s, a lot of the changes associated with the 60s actually occurred in the 70s to mid 70s. These were eras of optimism and eras of a lot of change. And one of the ways this was expressed in fashion was hairstyles. Now, interestingly, it was the women who changed their hairstyles in the 1920s. This is the era where the suffrage amendment has just been passed to the Constitution. And women are wearing much more comfortable clothing than their female ancestors had worn up until that age. You look at the dresses in the 20s and eras preceding it, there's no comparison. It's, the dresses and skirts are a bit shorter. You can show your ankles and your calves. And the clothing just looks more comfortable. And the women did something unprecedented in Western civilization. They cut their hair. They got a bob. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote a short story called Berenice Gets a Bob, or Bernice Gets a Bob, something like that, to illustrate the importance of having bobbed hair if you were a woman in the 1920s. Okay, the 1960s, it was the men who changed their hairstyle. The men let their hair grow out like the Beatles had, and the men sometimes even had longer hair than the women, who in the 1960s and 70s might have been wearing a bob. Now, interestingly, also in the 1960s and 70s, a man's long hair was associated with rock and roll. Now, prior to that, long hair music meant classical music. That was a very formal type of music, but if you were, dedicated to it, it kind of required so much dedication that maybe you couldn't pay as much attention to, sexual stereotypes or sexual expectations. So you might just let your hair grow long, because you were working on your classical music and not bothering with going to a barber. But anyway, I do think it's very interesting that in both the 1920s and the 1960s, the idea of optimism and change was reflected with a radical change in hairstyles. And I also find it significant, that interesting at least, that in the 1920s it was the women who made the hairstyle change, and the 1960s it was the men who made the hairstyle change. And I hope you like hearing that. And I hope you'll subscribe. I hope you tell other people about me and help me grow my social media presence. Thank you if you do.